what is laziness? I think the way that I would define it is it's just ignoring responsibilities and, knowing that you need to do something, but just choosing to neglect that, choosing to run away from that, so that things that need to get done don't get done, and not in a healthy way. Because obviously, like, rest is very important, and not doing things is essential to being able to do things well. But when it becomes a way of running away from doing things in an unhealthy way, I think is when it turns to laziness. And I think one cause of laziness, honestly, can just be selfishness. And where I get that idea from is actually from Jesus, because during his time here on earth, he was a very disciplined guy. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, one of the purposes of our relationship with him is supposed to make us more like him, to mold us into his image, if you will. And Paul tells us in Ephesians to be imitators of God. But the God that we're imitating is both disciplined and selfless, and I don't think those can necessarily be separated. And we see that all throughout the life of Jesus. Scripture also tells us, I think it's in Matthew, that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And so when I think about Jesus and his discipline, part of that discipline came from the fact that he wasn't doing things for himself, but he was choosing to live a life for the people around him and ultimately for the world. And I think that was what aided him in being disciplined in the way that he was a constant reminder and a constant motivation for the things that he was doing came not from, what can I get from this, but what can I give to other people? And how can I help ultimately the world through me being disciplined today? I think another cause, obviously I think there's a lot, but I think, another cause would probably be entitlement. And like a loose definition of entitlement, I would say, is just, thinking that we deserve things, that we deserve what we have, or even saying that we deserve what we don't have. And I think that's, when you think like that, I think it's an easy excuse to be lazy. But again, like the purpose of our relationship with Jesus is to become more like him through it. And I think Jesus is a great model of the opposite of entitlement, which I think the opposite of entitlement for me I would define as gratitude and humility. And in Philippians chapter 2, I'm not going to quote this 100% correct, but I believe it talks about how Jesus in his very nature was, fully God and fully man, but he chose to not take up that mantle in a way for people to serve him, but instead he chose to be fully man and fully God here, but use that as an advantage to other people and not to himself. And so entitlement wasn't really something that you ever saw in Jesus's life. But if anybody had a reason to be entitled, I think it was Jesus, like to literally be on earth but be God. I don't think any of us will ever know what that is like. But he did, and even though he was fully God and fully man and was here and could have done whatever he wanted, he chose to come here for all of us, and he chose to live a life of selflessness, denying himself anything that he could ever want, and chose to live a sinless life, even though he could have done all of those things, and chose to go to the cross even when he didn't have to, so that all of us now could experience life and life to the fullest, as it says in John 10:10. And so, I think those are two pretty big causes of laziness would be selfishness and entitlement. And I think one thing that laziness can kind of cost us in this life is a bad representation of Jesus. When I think about laziness and discipline, two scriptures that immediately come to mind, and I'm probably not going to quote these 100% correctly either, are Colossians 3:23 and 1 Corinthians 10:31. Colossians 3:23 says, and again, I'm probably not going to get this 100% right, but it says, whatever you do, work at it as if you're working for the Lord and not for men, because ultimately it's from God that you receive your reward, and not from man. And 1 Corinthians 10:31, it says, whatever you do, whether you eat or whether you drink or whether whatever you're doing, do it all for the glory of God. And so when I think about laziness and discipline, again, those two verses really stick out to me, and they kind of put a why or a purpose behind why I work and why I'm disciplined, and that everything we do is ultimately for God's glory, and we get our reward not from things here, but ultimately our reward is from Him. Ultimately Jesus was all about having a relationship with us, and the way that discipline and selflessness and humility and gratitude can really make itself evident in our lives is through our relationships with other people. And so that's a huge cost of laziness, is not only a bad representation of Jesus to other people, but also just the ability to love people and to lean into your relationships with them, to lean into their needs and to be able to meet their needs, and to literally be Jesus for them through meeting their needs, through loving them, through listening to them, through just being whatever they need in that moment. And so I think when I think about laziness, and I think about defining it and what causes it and what it can cost us. I think all of those, at least for me, kind of encapsulate all of that.
Discipline is, what is it? Salvation is the start of spiritual maturity, but discipline is the process of becoming more like the Lord. And that might sound like something that's challenging, but in the end, it is totally worth it to becoming more like the Lord. And I think part of the challenge is that we're going from death to life. And if you think about it, going from a grave that is 6 feet in the ground to walking around and living life, that's not exactly an easy process to be going through. Well, the cause of discipline. I think something that I think of is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. The cause of discipline is love. It's what drives us. It's what pushes us forward to be disciplined, is our love. And God, as we're loving Him, it makes us more like Him. And He is love. And so if He is love and love is not self-seeking, then He is a selfless God. And if we're trying to be becoming more like Him, then we're called to be selfless as well. Now, the cost of discipline, and cost might sound like a weird phrase here because it's discipline, and that is the positive thing here. But the cost of discipline is to take up your cross. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The cost is to do hard things with the people you love, but to serve those around you. Selfishness, it isolates us and elevates us, but we're made to value others above ourselves and to live in community. So the cost is to deny ourselves, consider others more important than ourselves, and to love. Now, the cure for laziness might seem simple, but I think it's discipline despite difficulty. A great example of this is an army story that I've heard. And it's in the middle of war, right? And everyone is tired and hungry and exhausted. But there's a special task force that's sent out, and they have to go. And where they're going to be dropped off at is in the middle of the jungle, and it has to be in the middle of the night. But they're going to have to crawl for miles and miles and miles in enemy territory. And so it's almost an impossible task, but in the end, they start crawling and they start crawling, and they finally reach their goal and they reach their mission. And afterwards, they're asked, well, how did you do that? And their answer was this: we knew it was going to be hard before we started, but we decided that we were going to do it and we were going to reach our goal no matter what. So we didn't decide in the middle of it when it was already going to be hard, when we were going to be more tired than we already were, when we were going to be in pain and struggling. That if we would have waited to decide then, we would have never reached our goal. So the thing here is to do hard things, even when you know they're going to be hard, and to determine that from the outset. And a big takeaway here is that obedience is not determined by the outcome. Obedience is not determined by the outcome. And so what that means is this: your obedience to follow the Lord's will, that is a decision that moves you and makes you more like the Lord at the time. Your obedience is not determined by how the outcome turns out. What the result you get is not dependent on your obedience. And just a couple of disclaimers, if you will. One comes from Ephesians chapter 2, is that our faith is not based on works, but it's based on grace. And that's a free gift from God, so that none of us can boast about, well, I did this, and then I did this, and I did this. Discipline is not just works. Also, discipline is not religion or legalism. So we must work hard and we must be disciplined, but we also have to remember that we've been given grace and we've been called to live in a new life. And the last thing is this: we're called to work hard and to be disciplined, but we're also called to rest and observe the Sabbath. And so work hard, but rest hard as well. Well, we meet again.
Here we are. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought? Man, that was fun.
It was. I had a really good time.
Yeah.
You want to talk about it some more?
Yeah, I'd love to.
A little more in depth on some things.
Yeah.
So I know, well, tell the people what your Enneagram number is.
Okay. I'm a 9.
And if you're not like informed of what the Enneagram is, it's just a personality test. But it goes a little more in depth than that. And so we're about to talk about that a little bit. So explain how your Enneagram number has kind of allowed you to speak into laziness and discipline in a different light.
Yeah. So each Enneagram number has a different core sin, if you will. And for 9s, it's sloth or laziness. And for 9s, our laziness isn't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to take a nap for 10 hours every single day or whatever that looks like, or not that 9s don't work hard. But our laziness comes from falling asleep to our emotions and feelings, if you will. And so it's really common for 9s to not feel deeply and to numb themselves. And so for me, that's looked like going to social media or Netflix and just like,
escape everything.
Yeah, escape everything. Because our laziness is that it's easier to not feel and it's easier to numb than for us to work hard and to process things and to feel things deeply.
Yeah.
For you, as a 4, oh, spoiler alert, he's a 4. What does that look like from laziness and discipline?
Well, the 4s, I think, is it called a core sin?
Yeah,
core sin, I think, is envy or jealousy, because we just like to compare ourselves to people, or it's just natural for us to do that. We don't really like it, but it's natural. And for me, it can kind of turn into from comparing myself to other people, more specifically comparing myself in ways to other people who I think are better than me or have more than me, or whatever it may be. It can kind of lead me to just not want to do anything because it's like, well, I'll never be them, or I'll never have what they have. I'll never be as good at that as they are. So like, why even try to get there? So that's some things that it's made itself evident in my life. Yeah. But then I have to remember that, where I am and where God's put me is for me and not for anybody else. Yeah. Like my relationships with the people that I have in my life are my relationships with them and nobody else's. And the opportunities that I have are mine and nobody else's, not in a selfish way or in a conceited way, but God's put me here for a purpose as well. And that's to love the people around me. And the way that I safeguard against, being lazy from comparing myself to other people is kind of reminding myself that I was made for a time such as this, and God created me with things in advance for me to do, and those are mine and nobody else's. And so whether my calling or what I'm doing looks like somebody else, what somebody else is doing, or whether it looks as good or as bad or whatever in comparison to what other people are doing, that doesn't really matter, because what matters is me being faithful with what God's given me. So I just have to remind myself of that.
Yeah. Do you have any super practical, this is 2 things I do to keep me disciplined?
Well, I practice Sabbath, as we talked about earlier, which is in general, I don't think we have the time to really dive into that, but it's just this 12 or 24 hours, I would say, where I dedicate to using that time for rest. And that when I have that in mind, I usually do it at the end of the week, but when I have that in mind, it kind of it makes me be more disciplined throughout the week, because I know at this point at the end of the week I have to rest, and so I have to get this stuff done by then. So that's what keeps me on track with that.
Yeah. Almost like work hard for 6 days so that I need to rest.
Yeah, like you have to be disciplined in order to rest, and rest is something that you have to discipline yourself to do. That's what I would say.
Great. Bet. It's laziness
Sounds
and
good.
discipline for you.
Let's do it. Yeah.